Hey guys, welcome back to the salon. So it's time to delve back into Night Gallery. And since we already covered the pilot episode as well as the very short first season, we're going to get into the second season now. Now, because season 2 actually had 22 episodes in it as opposed to only 6 in the first season, I'm actually going to kind of tackle this project in 6 episode chunks, just like I do with Thriller, like on some of my other videos. So, without further ado, let's get into the first half dozen episodes of season 2 of Night Gallery, which actually ran from 1971 to 1972. So, episode 1, the first segment is called The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes. And this was, as many of the other segments on Night Gallery were, was written for the screen. The teleplay was written by Rod Serling. And this was actually directed by John Badham, not entirely sure, like how you pronounce his last name. But he's quite a well-known director, particularly back in the 70s and 80s. He did Saturday Night Fever. He did the 1979 Dracula with Frank Langella. He did War Games. And Short Circuit, like in the 1980s. So, you know, again, kind of a well-known guy. So this first segment is actually like a pretty good one. It also stars the rather prolific character actor Clint Howard, obviously brother of Ron Howard, and he was in a bunch of other things on his own. And he was actually just like a preteen in this. He probably like 10, 11 years old, something like that. I will also note that the source story that this segment was based on was written by Margaret St. Clair, who also wrote a really good story called The Estuary, which actually turned up in one of my favorite horror fiction anthologies ever, like 1968's Alfred Hitchcock Presents Stories That Scared Even Me, which I've talked about on my blog. I've talked about like multiple times because, like I said, it's my favorite horror fiction anthology ever. So she didn't write like this story that this is based on isn't in that anthology, but the same author like wrote another story in that. So does that make any sense? Okay, good. So at the beginning of the story, you have this kind of stereotypically douchebaggy TV producer type dude, and he gets approached by his underlings, and they tell him, "Hey, we have this fantastic act for the, very coveted Wednesday night TV time slot." Now, this act that they're pitching consists solely of like a nerdy 10-year-old kid whose name is Herbie, who sits in a chair and basically like talks really enthusiastically about all the neat things he learned that day from all of his voracious reading. So obviously the producer is just like apoplectic at this. He's like, nobody in their right mind is going to watch a geeky kid rambling about random bullshit on network TV. So, you guys are super fired. But then, in the middle of this kid's very wholesome litany of facts that he's presenting, Herbie suddenly kind of like stops talking suddenly, like he just got like a message from somewhere. And then he tells the live audience that a young girl who's been missing for several days in the mountains will actually be found alive, but she will have a broken leg. He also predicts that there will be a very severe earthquake, like early the following morning, like he even says what time it happens and everything like that, and it'll cause like a whole bunch of damage and, sadly, also some fatalities. So obviously the producer doesn't like believe any of this nonsense, and he tells the kid and his grandfather, who's also kind of his minder manager type thing, he's like, just get the fuck out of my studio and never come back. And he even like orders, because I guess it was like a live show, and he even orders the tapes of the show like erased. That like that's how embarrassed he is about the whole kerfuffle. So naturally, though, the producer kind of very quickly changes his tune when the next day comes and both of Herbie's predictions come true exactly as he said they were going to. So the story actually then jumps ahead a year. And Herbie, by this point, has kind of become this massive celebrity. And it seems he's really, really good, a really good psychic, because fully 100% of his predictions absolutely come true exactly the way he says them. So, like I said, that's pretty good. So he's got like all these parapsychologists and they want to study him, and he just is getting inundated with letters from people all over the world, like from people who want his help and stuff, like asking them to predict things for them. So, and the cool thing about it is that Herbie as a kid, even though all of this stuff is going on and he has like all these new pressures on him, he's just like a really cheerful, very humble kid, and he remains like just very eager to please, you know what I mean? However, one day, just a few minutes before he's supposed to go on for his weekly show, he suddenly starts to seem really troubled. And he tells his grandfather, I need to go home. He's like, I'm not sick or anything like that, but I just don't think that I can do the predicting thing today. And you're just kind of like, uh-oh, what did that kid see? You know what I mean? Now, his grandfather, like, immediately steps in and is like, of course, you know, I'm going to take you right home right now. And so he, like, scoops the kid up and, like, starts to take him out of there. But the producer obviously just, like, blows his stack. It's like, holy shit, like, you know, you're supposed to do the show and you have a contract and blah, blah, blah. But then, like, after a while, like, he starts screaming at him. But then after a while, he's like, oh, maybe it'll work better if I was, like, actually not such a douche. So he's like, well, think about all the people that look forward to your show every week and, like, you're helping all these people and how can you let them down? So he kind of goes that route. So, and that actually does end up working. So Herbie is like he just kind of like stoically says, okay, I'll do it. So when Herbie goes on though, like initially he doesn't make any predictions at all. Like for most of the show, and this is what they imply that the show is usually like, is like he'll sit there and go, hey, I read this neat book about, you know, I don't know, railroad track engineering or whatever the fuck. And he's like, and I've learned all these cool facts. But then like in the middle, he'll be like, okay, like this is what's going to happen. You know what I mean? So it's like that. So this show, he basically just does the earlier thing, like where he's like, look at this neat thing that I learned for pretty much the whole show. So obviously like the producer is like standing behind the camera going, like, you know what I mean? It's like, is this kid going to make any predictions? Oh my God, like we're going down the toilet like so fast. And like he's just like losing his shit, right? But then finally, you know, toward the end of the show, he actually gets that pause that means that he's gonna like, you know, say some profound shit, right? Now, he starts to make what sounds like a very strange prediction. He basically tells the TV audience, tomorrow is going to be the start of like a whole new world. Everybody will get along. There will be no more prejudice. There will be no more war, anything like that. And he also makes really subtle allusions to the Garden of Eden, like implying that whatever's going to happen tomorrow is going to be amazing, like a new beginning for the human race. And I'm like, uh-oh, like that sounds really bad. So after he signs off, like everybody's sort of confused, obviously, about Herbie's weird predictions that he made. But people also seem kind of jazzed about it too, because it's like, wow, it sounded pretty awesome. And Herbie has always been right about every single one of his predictions before. So obviously tomorrow is just it's going to be amazing. Everybody's going to get along. It's no more war. It's awesome. Yay. But just like I said, because you know this is kind of like a horror story, you know that there's more to it than what he said. And indeed there is. Later on, he actually tells his grandfather and the parapsychologist who's like befriended him that what he actually saw in his vision, he doesn't really have visions, he says. He's like, it's not words and it's not pictures. He can't really explain like how he gets them. But that's neither here nor there. But he said that he saw that the sun was going to go nova tomorrow. And it was going to just essentially like wipe out the entire Earth, like in the blink of an eye. So, you know, that's pretty hardcore. So because the producer of the show like persuaded him to go ahead and do the usual show, like, you know, because the producer said, oh, everyone's depending on you, he decided that the best course of action, because he knew it was going to come true, was that I'm going to tell everybody that things are going to change for the better tomorrow, because he didn't want anyone to panic or worry. And he knew that it was going to happen so fast that no one would really be aware of what was going on. So he just wanted everyone to go out happy, like expecting something great, and then it would just hit and they wouldn't know any better. You know what I mean? So yeah, right out the gate, a pretty bleak ending, gotta say. But it was a damn good story regardless, I'm going to say. Clint Howard, and like I said, he's a kid in this, but he was great. He just came across as very compassionate, very self-possessed. And, you know, his whole thing was he was just, like, able to do the whole human race a solid by just, like, chilling everyone out. Even though he knew for sure that the world was going to end. And, like, he managed to keep calm enough about it to, like, calm everyone else down about it. Which I thought was, like, really cool. He was, like, a really cool character. So, yeah, this was, like, a really good installment. So the next one was called Miss Lovecraft Sent Me. And this is not so much a story as kind of, like, a silly, kind of trifling vignette that's only a few minutes long. I don't even know how many minutes long it is. It seemed like 4 or 5 minutes long, maybe, not even that long. So this one has a babysitter who's actually played by Sue Lyon, Sue Lyon. She was in Lolita, the Stanley Kubrick movie, as a kid. So she shows up at what is very clearly a haunted castle, and the door gets answered by like a full-on Halloween vampire man, like complete with the cape and the blue skin and the fangs and the cheesy Eastern European accent and all of that stuff. So the babysitter, who's like unfazed by this, she pretty much makes some small talk with the Count about the kid that she's supposed to be babysitting. Now you never see the kid, him, her, it, whatever it is. But it's implied by sound effects that it's kind of like some kind of monster, like maybe a werewolf or something like that, and that evidently the babysitter has been lured to this house so that the monster can eat her, I'm assuming. But she kind of figures out what's going on and just hightails it out of there before, obviously she becomes a monster snack. And then the Count just comes cluelessly back in the living room like, oh, I wonder where she went. Wah, wah. It's kind of like that. So yeah, so this one was kind of dumb. It's kind of funny, but mostly dumb. This was just, it seemed like one of those segments that was clearly just like wedged in to fill up time between the longer, more substantial stories. So the next one is called The Hand of Borgus Weems. And this was another pretty decent, like, longer story. This one was actually based on a short story by George Langeland, I guess that's how you pronounce his last name, and directed by John M. Lucas. So in this one, there's a man named Peter, and he seems to be having some trouble controlling his hand and possibly one of his feet. Because while he's driving down this kind of crowded street, he straight up attempts to purposely run down a pedestrian, even though his facial expressions, clearly suggest that he's horrified by his own actions. Like, what are you doing, hand? You know what I mean? It's that kind of shit. So the pedestrian is actually not hurt, and Peter ends up crashing his car into a pole, but he's mostly okay too. Well, at least physically, I guess. So then, in the next scene, we see Peter at the office of this guy named Dr. Ravdon, who is actually played by Ray Milland, very, very famous actor. And he's basically begging the doctor to cut his right hand off. Now, naturally, the doctor doesn't want to do this because there's actually nothing wrong with Peter's hand. Now, Peter tries to explain that his right hand has a mind of its own and will murder someone if it isn't stopped. But obviously, the doctor he's like, yeah, I'm just going to refer you to a psychiatrist, okay, because you clearly have some issues. At this point, though, Peter, who's very, very desperate, he grabs like this heavy marble bust or like a paperweight or something like that, and he just goes ham on his hand. He just like fucks it all up and smashes it all up. So he injures it so badly that the doctor now has no choice but to amputate it. So while he's in recovery after his hand gets cut off, Peter tells Dr. Ravdon about just the whole sad story. So then we kind of go into like an extended flashback, right? So it seems that Peter first noticed his hand just, kind of doing its own thing when he went into this building for like a meeting for his work or whatever, and his hand deliberately pushed the wrong buzzer, like for the wrong apartment, even though Peter could see that it was the wrong one, but his hand just went nope and did that, and he's like, huh, that's curious, you know what I mean? So he goes to the wrong apartment anyway, and there ends up meeting like a hot blonde named Susan, who he ends up becoming engaged to after only like 3 days after meeting her. I'm like, holy crap, okay. So he said, well, it must have been fate. My hand said, oh, you just go like buzz that lady's apartment. So, well, obviously you're the person I'm going to marry, so that's how we're going to do it. So anyway, not long after that, so his hand started like paging through this phone directory thing like by itself and pointing to the phone number of this dude named Brock Ramsey. And then it dialed the number without Peter's permission because he's like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? It's just kind of that kind of thing. And then the hand wrote the name Borgus Weems, which is a crazy name, on a piece of paper. Now, it's implied that Peter's brain is also maybe subtly being manipulated by the hand, I guess. Like I don't know what the deal is. But so he ends up telling the guy on the other end of the line that it's Borgus Weems calling because he's reading it like off the paper that the hand wrote it on. And then the guy on the other end is like, what? And then like he hangs up, you know what I mean? So obviously something weird is going on here. Meanwhile, Peter goes and purchases a gun, and his hand attempts to kill his girlfriend, Susan, but does not succeed because he's like, I don't want to do it. She's like, well, I don't want you to do it either. I don't want you to do it either. And so she's like, he just like ends up shooting up in the air or something like that. He also tries to run over the guy in the street, which we saw, kind of in the cold open. And then Brock Ramsey, the guy on the phone, shows up at Peter's place, and he says, I knew a guy named Borges Weems who lived in this very apartment like I think it was like a few years before, something like that. Now Peter's hand tries to shank this dude too, but Peter is actually like able to override it. He's like, you really need to stop it with the murdering. You know what I mean? He's that kind of thing. He's like, no, don't do it. Get out of here. You know what I mean? So it's suggested that it was at this point that Peter ended up like consulting the doctor about having this wayward hand chopped off so it wouldn't do any more of this attempted murdering business. So then we kind of come back to the quote unquote present day. So even though the doctor still thinks Peter is delusional, obviously, as you would, something about the story kind of sticks in his craw though. So he actually asks a cop that he knows to sort of look into this whole situation. Now the cop happened to have worked on this case several years before, in which a man named Borges Weems had his hand lopped off and then was pushed to his death from the window of his high-rise apartment, which was the very same apartment that Peter is now living in. And the cop also tells Peter and the doctor that Brock Ramsey and his then girlfriend Susan, yes, that Susan, who was also Weems's niece, were suspected to be the ones who had killed him. I think it was like some kind of monetary whatever. But a lawyer was able to get them off. So the lawyer was the same guy who Peter had attempted to run over in the street. So what is like Borges Weems, his little disembodied hand, which was all that was left of him in the apartment, because like I said, the rest of him was like splattered on the concrete outside his window. So the hand is just like the ghost, I guess. So like the hand just takes over the hand of the person living in the apartment. It's like, come on, hand, like do my shit, like avenge me. You know what I mean? And so it's that kind of thing. So at the very end of the story, Borges Weems's hand ghost appears to transfer to Dr. Ravdan because, like I said, Peter had his hand cut off. It's not like he could just go to the left hand. I guess that wouldn't work. It has to be the right hand, I suppose. So he goes into the doctor's hand, and because the doctor starts writing shit, he's like, what the fuck? I don't know Latin. It's that kind of situation. So I'm guessing now that, like, the doctor will presumably have to amputate his own hand, and then I guess like the cycle will just continue until somebody like finally offs the people responsible for Borges Weems' death, and at which case like the hand can finally be a piece or whatever. So yeah, I mean, stories about possessed hands, I feel like it's kind of something of a small horror subgenre, like all on its own. Like I think I did a big long thing on my blog about the Hands of Orlac from the 1920s. Or I also talked about the Thriller episode, which is called The Terror Antiquid, which was kind of like a similar kind of possessed hands type of story. But so even though this has been done before, this was actually like a pretty good story, like a pretty compelling story. And it really kept me entertained and guessing through the entire runtime. You do have to like pay attention to all the details though, because the story is kind of a little bit complicated. So the last segment on episode 1 was called Phantom of What Opera? And this was like another kind of throwaway vignette that's only a couple of minutes long. And this one actually has an unrecognizable Leslie Nielsen. I wouldn't have known it was Leslie Nielsen if it didn't say that in the credits. So he plays the Phantom, and Marianne Beck is kind of the hapless victim or whatever. So as in the original story, the Phantom is carrying this struggling woman down to his underground lair and, starts to play his pipe organ and telling her, never take off my mask or you'll be sorry, and all that kind of stuff. But of course, she comes up behind him and does take the mask off, and Leslie Nielsen looks all kind of fucked up under there, like really fucked up. But then, in something of a ridiculous turnabout, I guess, like the woman's face and the front part of her hair are like torn off in the struggle, like she was wearing a mask with like hair on it. And so then it's revealed that she is actually just as fugly as the Phantom. So then they just kind of like look at each other like, what? And then they like hug each other. And I was just kind of like, okay. Because they found each other's like soulmates, I guess. Because everybody knows that super fugly dudes are always attracted to women who are fugly in the exact same way that they are. It's just facts. So yeah, this is another kind of why bother segment. I mean, I love Leslie Nielsen, don't get me wrong. But, I mean, the story just seemed kind of pointless. It's just like a bad one-note joke, like, taken to several minutes long. I just kind of feel like with these ones, I feel like if it was that important to fill up an exact time slot, why not just add a couple more minutes to the longer stories, like to flesh them out a little bit more, rather than putting these kind of dumb little asides in here. Like I said, they're only like a couple of minutes long, and they're usually just like, bump tish, you know what I mean? It's like that. They're just like kind of a joke, and it's usually like some kind of like funny quote unquote inversion, So I don't know. It doesn't really bother me that much, but I'm not really a big fan of the more humorous segments, other than the one that I talked about before that had John Astin and Phyllis Diller in it. Like, I really like that one. And that was kind of funny, but that was kind of fucked up and grim, too. So, it was like a black comedy. So, yeah, I just kind of wish there had been more focus on, like, beefing up the serious stories instead of featuring these kind of, like, just silly little comic relief interstitials. You know what I mean? That's all it is. So episode 2, the first segment is called Death in the Family. And this episode as a whole, like, follows the same format as the first one. It has, like, 2 long segments broken up by 2 really short, kind of insubstantial ones. The 2 shorter ones here are not quite as lame, but I'll get into that in a little bit. Now, this one, Death in the Family, I was actually really excited to rewatch this episode and this first segment in particular because A Death in the Family by Miriam Allen DeFord is a really, really good short story. And it's another story that I've read numerous times because it was in the anthology that I mentioned earlier, Alfred Hitchcock's Stories That Scared Even Me. Now, I have to say, okay, so while this segment is good, a lot of details are changed from the source story. And that was like a little bit disappointing, not gonna lie. I kind of wish the adaptation had been more faithful because I'm not sure that the changes worked all that well in some instances. And I might even argue that it's not really an adaptation at all because it's not really the same story. Like, some of the stuff is the same, but enough of it was changed that I might not have even said it was based on that story. You know what I mean? So E.G. Marshall is in this, and he plays an undertaker named Mr. Soames. Now, I will note that the protagonist in the original story was named Jared Sloan. I don't really know why they changed the name, but whatever. So at the beginning of the story, like, a couple of guys bring, like, a new stiff to the funeral home. So the dead dude lived in, like, an old folks home for the last 30 years of his life, I think they say. So he didn't have any family. He was being buried at the expense of the state because he didn't have any money. So Mr. Soames is just appalled that nobody cares about this man and just goes on and on, like, at great length about how nobody should be ignored and forgotten about like this guy was, especially in death. So, the meat wagon dudes are obviously just like, meh, who cares? You know what I mean? Because they carry stiffs around all day long. They're just very cavalier about it. But Mr. Soames decides he's going to do this dead man upright. He's going to celebrate him and appreciate him as a person the way that he never was afforded when he was alive, right? Meanwhile, there's this kind of young criminal. I think it was like he was like an armed robber or something like that. And he's been shot. Now, he breaks into the funeral home shortly after this. He's looking for a place to hide out from the cops. Now, he actually hears somebody singing for He's a Jolly Good Fellow, and soon discovers that Mr. Soames has not only done a really bang-up job of fixing up the dead guy, like he even puts him in like a swanky suit and everything, but he also sat the corpse upright in a chair and is kind of in the middle of having like a little farewell party for the dude, who he calls his father, which is kind of sweet, I guess, but, also weird as fuck. So the criminal kid evidently thinks so too. But, I mean, he's bleeding pretty bad. He got shot, like I said, and he doesn't really have the energy to get too upset about it, I guess. So Mr. Soames is actually really nice to him, and he's telling him, you're very young and you deserve compassion, not punishment, despite what you've done. And Mr. Soames actually ends up explaining that he was brought up in an orphanage, and it taught him that everyone's life had value, and that everyone deserved kindness and understanding, which is actually really nice. Now, as the story goes on, the criminal, whose name is Doran, and he's actually played by Desi Arnaz Jr., so there's that. He finds out that Mr. Soames has a whole family of preserved corpses in the joint, all seated around a table like they're having a big fucking shindig, right? Now, not long after this, the cops bust in, and they see this whole morbid situation going on, which now includes Doran, who was evidently added to the family, like, after he died of his wounds. Like, Mr. Soames didn't kill him. He was dying anyway, you know what I mean? So the cops then end up shooting Mr. Soames, who, kind of ends up being the last member of his dead family, which is kind of like a fitting ending, I guess. So as I mentioned, this was a pretty good episode, but it's not really all that much like the short story that it was supposedly based on, like I mentioned. In the original story, when you're reading it, you actually know from the very beginning that the Undertaker has a whole corpse family in the basement of the funeral home, because the first part of the story describes his very cozy daily routine and then goes into how he started obtaining the bodies for his little project, if you want to call it that. So the whole plot point about the Undertaker being like exceptionally compassionate toward the dead, that wasn't really in there. It's pretty clearly stated that Jared Sloan, who was the guy in the story, he constructed this family of dead people because he was an orphan and he was horribly lonely. He did actually love his deceased relatives very much and interacted with them as if they were, adored living members of a real family. So there was that. Now, also left out of the Night Gallery adaptation was the entire inciting incident of the original story. In that story, at the beginning, it wasn't two guys bringing like an old man who died of natural causes. In the original story, it was two kidnappers and murderers. And they left the dead body of a 10-year-old girl that they had murdered. Like, they had kidnapped her for ransom. The parents paid the ransom, but the dudes killed her anyway. And so they just like leave it on the doorstep and be like, and beat feet out of town. You know what I mean? Because they're afraid they're going to get caught. So the whole gist of the original story was that Jared was kind of torn between adding this little girl to his family because she had been exactly what he'd been looking for to complete the family, or doing the right thing for the girl's parents and the community and stuff by calling the police. So that was kind of, so that whole thing, like that whole conflict was like not even in this adaptation, which is what I meant when I said this, they really changed it so much that it's essentially not even the same story anymore. And like, I guess I get why the whole murders and the dead little girl thing, like from the original story, like got changed to like an older delinquent in the TV adaptation. I mean, murdered kids, that's a pretty hard sell on network television, especially back then. But like I said, the changes that they made overall were so significant that I kind of feel like the whole thrust of the original story was lost. So like I said, this was a good installment, but not really an adaptation of that short story that I love so much. So the next segment is called The Merciful, and it's another very short vignette with that kind of switcheroo gotcha energy that a lot of these had. So this one was essentially like a twist on the Cask of Amontillado, perhaps. So in this one, you're led to believe that this old man, played by King Donovan, is being walled up alive by his wife, who's played by Imogene Coca, because he's terminally ill, and apparently this is a better way to go, getting walled up alive. I'm not sure I agree, but okay. I mean, different strokes, I guess. But then the doorbell rings upstairs, and the old guy gets out of his chair and goes up this previously unseen staircase to answer it, which reveals that the guy isn't being entombed alive at all. The wife has actually bricked herself up behind a wall. So she's, you know what I mean? So the way they shot it. Presumably, I guess she's the one who's terminally ill and wants this to be the way she goes out, which again, fair enough. I mean, not the choice I would make, but that's not me. So like I said, amusing, but again, not really all that substantive. It's just basically like a long, couple minute long joke. So it's kind of a waste of time, not gonna lie. So the next segment is called Class of 1999, and this is based on another teleplay by Rod Serling, and this was directed by the dude whose name I cannot pronounce, Gino Swark, something like that. He did Jaws 2, Somewhere in Time, Supergirl, like all of those. So another thing that's cool about this segment is that it has fucking Vincent Price in it. We always love Vincent Price. He's good in everything. So anything that's got Vincent Price in it, I'll watch it. I don't give a shit. So this one, it's science fiction, but it pretty much takes place entirely in one room, like in one lecture hall. So Vincent Price is the instructor. And the situation is evidently these college students, this is like their final oral exam, you know what I mean? So Vincent starts kind of firing questions at each one of the students, and then as he calls on each of them, they stand up and they give like these rote answers back. Except for one guy named Johnson, who is only able to give him like three. He asks for who were the four people that did this and that and the other thing, and the guy can only think of three, and Vincent gets like super pissed and tells him he's a loser and all this other kind of shit. So at first, the questions are like science-based and are like pretty normal, you know what I mean? But Vincent then moves into another portion of the test, in which the questions become a little more uncomfortable, like a little weirder. Like, for example, Vincent asks a white student named Clinton to describe a black student named Barnes. And Clinton says that Barnes might be expected to be pushy or aggressive or possibly inferior. So we know where this is going. So then Clinton says that he wants to slap Barnes in the face. So Vincent tells him to do it. And then Barnes like gets a chance to retaliate. So he basically like slaps the white dude back, and then he's like, very good. And then they both sit down. You know what I mean? It's very weird. So also Vincent kind of tackles like class struggles and I guess like the envy of beauty or the envy of, people with money that are like good looking and stuff, because he kind of facilitates this confrontation between two women, like one of whom is kind of working class and like kind of dowdy and frumpy. Her name is Peterson, and then the other one is like really slim and beautiful and from a wealthy family and stuff. Her name is Field. So they have like a whole kind of situation there where they're like pulling each other's necklaces off and shit like that. So things go on like this for a bit. You're kind of wondering what exactly is going on here. Like, what kind of fucking class is this? You know what I mean? Like, what kind of school is this? So things start to escalate like pretty perilously when another white guy, whose name is Elkins, he targets this Asian guy in the back of the class whose name is Chang. He calls him an enemy and says he'd like to kill him. So Vincent actually like encourages this. He gives Elkins like a pistol to do it. But then in the end, Elkins can't bring himself to do it. Like, he realizes that maybe Chang isn't his enemy after all, and he like deliberately aims for the wall behind Chang, like, and then, shoots the wall instead of shooting the guy. And man, this really pisses Vincent Price off, like, big time. So then he tells his assistant, like at the back of the classroom, to essentially shut everyone down so he can figure out why he's encountering this resistance, he calls it. So the assistant like twists this knob, and all of the students freeze in place. So this reveals that they're actually super realistic cyborgs, essentially, who Vincent is training to be, I guess, like hostile toward other races and classes, like in the same way that humans are. So it's also implied that conformity to this program is like of the utmost importance. Anybody with ideas different than what has been taught is like considered a traitor pretty much. So because Elkins couldn't shoot Chang like he was asked to, like another white guy, the one named Johnson that had messed up the earlier science question where he can only give 3 out of the 4 names, he actually ends up redeeming himself by shooting Elkins for being a subversive. And like I said, that then you see that it's like a robot because he shoots Elkin in the face, and you can see like all the, machines and microchips and shit like that back there. So it turns out that the human race has been severely depleted, like through wars and environmental disasters and things like that. And so these robots are kind of being primed as human replacements. But in order to be accurate representations of us, they have to be programmed, like I said, to be hostile and bigoted toward others not like them. And basically Vincent Price says at one point, we'll repay our debt to men, I'm assuming by inventing them, by emulating him. We shall act as men, we shall react as men, we shall be men. So they're trying to be as close to humans as possible, like I said, because they appreciate that humans invented them and they're like taking our place, you know what I mean? So that implies, I guess, like that Vincent is also a cyborg. And during his commencement speech, which happens at the end, he basically says that the primary mission of the university is to teach the robots to be like just but ruthless, to kind of rid themselves of what they call misplaced compassion, and to never tolerate an inferior. So I'm like, wow, that's nice. So I feel like Rod Serling wrote a lot of stories about prejudice. I think this might be his best one, though. It's not quite as like overt or heavy-handed as his stories would usually go, like along those lines. And I think like seeing this kind of like bigotry and stuff like that taught by rote, like right alongside hard sciences and stuff, is pretty chilling. And I thought it was like a pretty clever like way to go about the story. Vincent Price is great in this. He's great in everything. And he's just like this very dispassionate instructor. And even though the whole thing like takes place in one location, its implications are a lot wider than just this having this intimate setting would suggest. And I gotta say, it's pretty sad that like its message really hasn't dated at all in the more than 50 years since it first aired. So, yay us. So this last segment is called Satisfaction Guaranteed. Now, for some reason, and I'm not entirely sure why this is, I have to like do a deeper dive on this, but when episode 2 of Night Gallery first aired on network TV, like the first time, this final segment of this episode was actually one called Witch's Feast. But for whatever reason, I don't know if there was some kind of controversial thing about that segment or something like that, every time this episode subsequently played in reruns, and when it was released on DVD, the segment Witch's Feast was replaced with this one, Satisfaction Guaranteed, which actually had originally aired as the third segment of episode 22, which was like the last episode of season 2. Like, does that make sense? Okay. But yeah, so I've never even seen Witch's Feast, and I don't even know if you can get it anywhere. So like I said, I don't know if it was too controversial to show, and so they're like, yeah, we can't show that shit anymore, or anything like that. So I don't know how that goes. So yeah, so this is another fairly short vignette. It's a little bit longer than some of these other ones, and it's not quite as one-note jokey as some of the other ones, although it's a little bit like that. So this one actually has the ubiquitous character actor Victor Buono, and he plays like this really wealthy dude, and he's seeking to hire somebody from an agency, presumably as a secretary or an assistant or something like that. So the woman who's running the agency, his name is Mrs. Mount, she apparently takes great pride in the excellence of all of her candidates, and she tells him that she's never had a single complaint in all of her 25 years of business. So the rich dude is pretty skeptical about this, but he's also still hopeful that the agency will be able to meet his needs, whatever they are. So one by one, Mrs. Mount like calls in all the various possibilities that she's selected. All of them are just these lovely young women with just sterling qualifications, like they could type super fast and they could take shorthand and blah, it's all this other kind of stuff. But the dude is just really not impressed with any one of them. And as each one is kind of rejected, Mrs. Mount is just getting more and more distraught because she's like, oh man, here goes my fucking reputation, you know? Now, because this is Night Gallery, you're pretty sure that this dude is hiring a woman for something other than secretarial work. I mean, obviously. But for a few minutes, you're not really sure exactly what that is. So after all the top candidates have been dismissed, this very tall, awkward, kind of meaty, kind of slovenly woman kind of rolls in and starts filing some papers in the office. Like, she's not one of the candidates. She just, like, works there or whatever. So the dude's eyes just light up at the sight of her. And he offers Mrs. Mount some enormous sum of money. They don't tell you how much it is, but it's some enormous sum of money, like, for this woman's services. He wants her in particular. So Mrs. Mount is really confused by this. She tells him, it's like, look, this woman is completely useless. Like, she can't type. She can't take shorthand. Her penmanship is atrocious. Like, the coffee she makes is fucking undrinkable. You know what I mean? Like, so why she's even allowed to work at this agency at all, like, given all of these limitations that she has, and, you know, considering the unblemished reputation of the agency, like, up to this point, this is never explained. So I don't, maybe she's somebody's niece or something like that. I'm not really sure. But it turns out that all of that doesn't really matter, because after the dude hands over the check, like, for her services, he straight up puts on a bib and pulls some cutlery, like, out of his pockets or his bag or whatever. Yeah, he's gonna eat this woman right in Mrs. Mount's office. Just bold as you please. You know. And I was like, damn, the rich really are different from the rest of us. He just assumed everyone's going to be okay with a little light cannibalism, you know. Oh, okay, if I eat her here, awesome. You know, just right on your desk. It's like shit like that. I mean, he did pay for the meal after all, so I guess that's what he's thinking. So, yeah. So, again, I mean, this one's kind of funny, but also just kind of there to fill time. And really, even though it was longer than some of the other ones, it really just kind of amounted to kind of a long fat joke. I mean, the woman wasn't fat, but they did show that she was, like, real tall and, like, real meaty, like, real, like, voluptuous, you know what I mean? So he's just like, ooh, delicious, you know what I mean? It was that kind of thing. So it was kind of like a long fat joke. It was better than the vampire babysitter one, though. I'll give it that. So episode 3. The first segment of this is called Since Aunt Ada Came to Stay. And this segment, actually one of the most fun ones so far, I thought. So it was based on a short story by A.E. Van Vogt? I'm not really sure. Who is actually a very prolific and extremely important science fiction writer whose style was a big influence on Philip K. Dick. So there you go. This story isn't really sci-fi, though. It's actually kind of an old-school witchcraft story, which actually is one of my favorite subgenres of horror. I love old-school witch stories, so that's probably why I liked this one a lot. So we have elderly Aunt Ada, and she has moved in with her ostensible niece, Joanna Lowell, and Joanna's professor husband, Craig. Now, the fun fact is that the actor and actress playing Craig and Joanna, who were James Ferrantino and Michelle Lee, were actually married in real life at the time that they were in this. So anyway, so the professor, Craig, thinks Ada is a weirdo and doesn't like having her around, but Joanna seems to have, you know, taken a shine to this cackling old bat, and her endless supply of herbal teas. Now, it's made pretty clear from the beginning of the story that Ada is a witch. I mean, she's kind of shown like chanting spells and making super occulty movements, like with her little witch stick in her bedroom, which I guess is a broomstick, but it doesn't have a broom on the end. It's just a stick, you know what I mean? She like waves around. It's also established that Ada is allergic to flowers, not a specific kind of flowers, just flowers in general. And also that Professor Craig has a weird affectation where he wears like a green carnation in his lapel, like whenever he goes to work. So you just know that those two things are gonna like factor into the plot eventually, and indeed they do. Now it so happens that there's another professor at the college whose name is Nick Porteous, and he's actually played by Jonathan Harris, probably best known as Dr. Smith from Lost in Space. So this guy is interested in the occult, and he wants to discuss Craig's green carnation in regards to the occult. But Craig, who actually teaches philosophy and logic and stuff like that, just doesn't have time for all of this supernatural bullshit, and he just doesn't want to hear it. Now, despite his skepticism, though, he is starting to find Aunt Ada just a little bit freaky, because one day she actually seems to kind of teleport. Like, she sort of like is sitting in the yard, and he's like working in the yard, and then he looks over and it's like, boop, she's gone, like she disappeared. And then when he goes inside to be like, what the fuck, like Ada and his wife Joanna like claim they've been in the kitchen sipping tea this whole time, you know what I mean? And even though Ada is just like, hee, I was just outside and I just teleported in here, and he was like, you dumb fucker. It was that kind of situation. He's just like, what? Yeah. So after he wakes up really late one night and finds Ada and Joanna having yet another little tea party like down in the kitchen, like in the middle of the night, he decides he's going to get to the bottom of whatever this herbal beverage is that they're constantly drinking. So he actually takes a sample of it to the science lab at the university. And then the guy in there tells him that it's seaweed, but it's a particular type of seaweed known in folklore as witch's weed. The plot thickens. So Craig then goes to the occult guy, like Professor Proteus, to ask him about this stuff. And Proteus says that the weed is actually used by witches to facilitate their transfer into like a new younger body, so they can like prolong their lives indefinitely. So witches are just like hopping from body, like they get old in this one, they're just like cast it off and they jump in another one, I guess is what they're saying. So Proteus also tells Craig that very fortuitously the green carnation that he always wears is pretty much the only thing that can combat this witchcraft. I don't know if witchcraft in general or just this particular spell, I don't really know. Not long after this, though, Aunt Ada does a spell that makes Proteus drop dead of a massive stroke. If she could have done that any time, I'm not really sure why she didn't do that before he told Craig anything. But whatever. I'm not a witch. I don't know how shit works. So because of these events, because of all of that stuff happening, as well as the revelation, because at one point Craig actually does find out that Aunt Ada is not actually Joanna's aunt at all, but perhaps just a witch who took over that woman's body because that woman was dead, you know what I mean? So Craig actually becomes convinced that Ada is planning to transfer her consciousness or her soul or whatever into Joanna, like on the first full moon after the autumnal equinox, which I think is like coming up in a couple of days. So Craig tells Joanna what's going on with all that, but she thinks he's nuts and is like, yeah, we're going to have to call the men in the butterfly nets because that's crazy, bro. But Craig is like resolute, and he says, I am not going to let you out of my sight until that day for the transference has passed, because some bad shit's going to happen. So this actually does work for a while, but then one evening, Craig he's sort of obliged to take over a class like for another professor who has this big family emergency or whatever. So Joanna like goes with him, you know, so he can keep an eye on her. So she like sits in the classroom. But apparently Ada's powers work even over distances, because she's actually able to sort of psychically compel Joanna to slip out of the class and go back home so that the soul takeover can occur. So Craig finally notices that his wife is gone from the classroom, and he races home to try to save her. When he gets there, Joanna looks like she's unconscious, and Ada tells him it's too late, and she even like busts out a spell that makes a whole bunch of like witch clones of her, and they kind of overwhelm Joanna and keep Craig from getting to her and all this other kind of stuff. But then at the last minute, Proteus's ghost appears, or maybe it was just like a visual representation of Craig's memory of him, like telling him the shit. And he kind of reminds Craig about the whole green carnation thing. So the professor like whips it out of his lapel and like chucks it at the witch, and that like causes her to vanish in this pillar of green fire. You know what I mean? She doesn't go like, what a world, or nothing like that. But that's why I said that, like when I was watching it. But she didn't say that. She just burns down to nothing, and it's kind of nice because she leaves like nothing behind but this little burn mark on the carpet about the size of a $50. So, you know, that's a nice thing about witch deaths. There's never a mess to clean up afterward. So then at the very end, there's kind of like a little brief coda where it's suggested that Joanna, who appears to be back to normal, may actually still be housing the witch after all, because she looks really troubled, like at the sight of all these green carnations growing in front of the house. So, like I said, this was a really fun segment. It was kind of over the top, like particularly Ada's witch character. I mean, she was super witchy. You know what I mean? There was no question, like in anyone's mind. It's like, oh, obviously a witch. But I really liked that about it, honestly. Like, it just kind of leaned into the witchiness. It also like had some legitimately creepy shots, because Aunt Ada was almost always filmed like through kind of a fisheye lens that made her look kind of unsettling, like from certain angles. So I like that they did that. So like I said, I love classic witch stories anyway, so this one kind of like hit all the right notes for me, I guess. So the next segment is called With Apologies to Mr. Hyde, and this was kind of another pointless, very brief stab at humor. This one actually had Adam West in it as Dr. Jekyll, and he drinks this potion that's made by his hunchbacked assistant. Then he ends up turning into kind of like a vaguely Mr. Hyde-ish version of Adam West. Like, they didn't do too much to him, but you know what I mean. And then he yells at his assistant for putting too much vermouth in it. And I was like, har, har. You know what I mean? And I was just kind of like, I don't know. Like I said, I don't like these little funny joke segments. They're just like really annoying. So the next segment was called The Flip Side of Satan. Now, I have to say I wasn't a huge fan of this one either. This was actually directed by Gerald Friedman, based on a short story by Hal Dresner. So this one has Artie Johnson in it. He's probably best known from Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, if you guys are old enough to remember that. But he plays this kind of obnoxious like radio DJ named J.J. Wilson. Although I have to say, like, to be honest, he refers to himself in the third person so often that I actually thought JJ was a different character at first. Like, so for the first, like, third of the story, like, who is this JJ they keep talking about? And I'm like, oh, it's him. Because he keeps talking about himself in the third person. I was so confused. But yeah. So anyway, the setup is that JJ is this kind of like famous DJ from New York City, and his career has kind of been tanking for a while. So his agent has booked him in this guest slot at like this dinky, empty radio station out in BFE. And JJ is clearly not very happy about it. I mean, it's bad enough that this place, like I said, is just totally desolate and there's nobody else around. But JJ also discovers that this station only broadcasts from midnight to 6 a.m. That's the only time that it's on. And JJ can't play the music he wants. He has to like stick to this playlist, which has already been made up for him by persons unknown, I guess. So, I mean, this is essentially like a bottle segment. I mean, it takes place entirely in the radio station. There's only one actor. He's the only character. All of the information in this is basically imparted through JJ's phone calls to like various other people. So through these phone calls, it comes to light that JJ had been having an affair with his agent's wife, and that she's now dead, apparently by suicide. Now, according to some of the plot synopses that I read of this, the implication was supposed to be that JJ had actually killed her, but I didn't really pick that up while I was watching the segment. I don't know if that's because I wasn't paying close enough attention, or if that angle wasn't conveyed effectively, or if the people that wrote the plot synopses were just like writing in something that wasn't there. I just kind of more got the impression that, yeah, he was fucking around with her, and then, oh, too bad, so sad, like she killed herself over it. But some people seem to think that he had like also maybe murdered her, but I don't know. I didn't know if I was gonna go that far. So JJ's kind of like getting more and more anxious like as the night goes on, particularly because the numbered records that he's supposed to play are all like creepy horror movie music, you know what I mean? Like all like fucking pipe organ and shit. So after he plays a couple of them, one of the records starts having like satanic chanting on there, like talking about a sacrifice. So like at first, JJ thinks that the other DJs at the station are just like pranking him, right? But he actually gets more and more scared when he attempts to call the operator, and he's told that the number has been disconnected. So like the operator's been disconnected yet. And then he realizes that all the other DJs whose photos are like framed on the wall only worked at the station for a single day. So not too long after he figures out that like he's the sacrifice, he touches some doohickey like on the broadcasting equipment and gets electrocuted like and dies. And then after that, his photo like magically appears on the wall, like along with all the other ones, like with his single day that he was on there. So, like I said, this story was okay. I think I would have liked it more if it was a little bit more compelling, like a little bit more interesting. The premise was great, but I have to say, like, JJ was kind of an annoying character, and I just kind of wanted him to hurry up and get sacrificed already. You know what I mean? Because I knew where it was going. I also kind of think that too much time was allotted to him, like, arriving at the station, like, putting on this special fringed vest that he had. God, the 70s. And just kind of like puttering around looking at stuff, you know what I mean? I mean, it was pretty clear from the get-go what was going to happen, or like you knew along the lines of what was going to happen. So I think maybe they should have gotten to the meat of the story more quickly and maybe made JJ like a little bit less grating of a character, because he was kind of obnoxious. So episode 4, this first segment is called A Fear of Spiders, and this was another pretty decent segment. This one was written by Rod Serling and directed by the awesome John Astin, a.k.a. Gomez Addams from the original Addams Family TV show. He directed a couple of these, actually, and he was in a few of them, too. So in this story, Patrick O'Neill plays this kind of snotty, sort of rage-filled gourmet food critic of some kind, and his name is Justice. Now, prior to the events of the story, Justice had apparently gone out on a couple of dates with his upstairs neighbor, Elizabeth, who's played by Kim Stanley. Now, Elizabeth is kind of painted as like a lonely romantic type of character. Like, she's always reading, like, Jane Eyre and all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? So she's kind of getting a little bit needy now. She's kind of, like, calling him all the time and, like, knocking on his door at all hours, like, hoping for some lovin', I guess. And this is just driving Justice, like, completely around the bend, right? So he finally tells her outright that he's absolutely not interested in a relationship with her, and he doesn't want to see her again, and he's like a real douche about it. So Elizabeth is just taken aback, like just really shocked by his cruelty. But Justice corrects her and says he's only refreshingly blunt. That's what he says. Now, regardless of what you want to call it, Elizabeth does finally seem to get the message, and she kind of scuttles back to her apartment with her tail between her legs. Before she does that, though, she actually tells Justice that she hopes that one day he'll need someone. Like, he'll need help and compassion from somebody who loves him, perhaps, but that no such person will be there to provide it, like, when it's needed. You know what I mean? So she's, like, cursing him, essentially, but not, like, in a big showy way. So another thing about Justice is that he has severe arachnophobia. So it makes him a little bit mental when he sees this little fat, little cute spider, like, hanging out in his kitchen sink. So he tries to wash the little dude, like, down the drain, but, you know, the little guy just keeps crawling back up to say howdy. He's just like, hey, can't get rid of me so easily. I live here too, motherfucker. It's that kind of situation. So during this whole spider crisis, the landlord arrives to check out Justice's faulty thermostat, which I guess he had complained about earlier. And Justice complains about the spider infestation, which is literally like one spider, like, calm down. But the landlord does not even give a single atom of a fuck about this. Like, he basically makes it pretty clear that he thinks Justice is just like this femmy weenie who needs to do some actual physical work to, like, make him more of a man instead of all of this prissy writing nonsense that he's doing. So the little sink spider is still hanging out in there. And so Justice is, like, pretty edgy about all this. And then he kind of hears this fairly alarming sound, like, coming from his bedroom. So he goes to the bedroom and opens the door, and then he just sees this enormous fucking spider, like, on his bed. Like, the size of an ottoman or something, right? Like, it's massive. And he just, like, nopes the hell out of the apartment. And he runs up to Elizabeth's door. So he's trying to, like, butter her up. He's all contrite and apologizing for his terrible, terrible, like, earlier behavior. So Elizabeth is pretty wary about this, as, you know, most people would be. But she kind of reluctantly, like, lets him in for a drink. I mean, he's obviously very rattled. And he tells her about his overwhelming fear of spiders, and then tells her, you know, there's a spider in my bedroom downstairs that's the size of a fucking dog, and I just can't go back down there. So Elizabeth finds this all very, very amusing, and obviously thinks that Justice has completely lost his marbles. Now, because of his previous cruelty to her, she actually sees this as an opportunity for payback. And I was like, wow, good for her. So basically, she tells Justice, you are absolutely not staying here, motherfucker. I don't care how scared you are. You can go back down there and, like, hang out with all the spiders for all I care. But Justice, I mean, he begs her, like, at least come down to my apartment and check this whole situation out. Like, he wants to prove to her that the gigantic spider is actually there. So she's kind of like mocking him and stuff, but she's like, oh, okay, I'll go down there and check it out. So they go downstairs. Now, once in Justice's apartment, like, Elizabeth, like, looks around, but she doesn't see any spiders, like, not even the little guy that was in the kitchen sink earlier. So then she opens the door to the bedroom and tells Justice that there isn't any spider in there, you know, humongous or otherwise. He doesn't really believe her, but she's kind of like holding out her hand to him. It's like, come in and see for yourself, you big weenie, or whatever. But as soon as Justice goes into the bedroom, Elizabeth kind of like slips out and slams the door behind him, like locking it from the outside. And I was like, wow, you can lock that bedroom door from the outside? That's fucked up. And then she basically kind of laughs at Justice's distress, which I was kind of laughing at it too, not going to lie, because he's kind of a jerk. So she says, I'll come down and let you out in the morning. You'll be fine. Now, before she leaves, like, Justice starts screaming that the spider is in there with him. But, I mean, Elizabeth just kind of does a metaphorical mic drop, and she just sashays right out that apartment, leaving the screeching douchebag to just deal with that shit alone. You know what I mean? So it's actually, they never tell you in the story if the spiders, like either the little one or the big one, are real, or if they're just a kind of a product of Justice's imagination, I guess. I mean, it's possible that Elizabeth saw the big ass spider in the bedroom and decided to just fuck him, like let it attack him. But I'm kind of leaning more toward the idea that the spider wasn't real, and Elizabeth just thought it would be funny to like fuck with him because he absolutely did think it was real. And, you know, to her credit, it was actually really funny because Justice was a tool and he got what he deserved. So while I was watching this segment, I wondered if it was an influence on the story from Creepshow, which is called They're Creeping Up on You. Like, the, you know, the one about the rich asshole whose germ-proof apartment gets overrun by cockroaches, like that one. I mean, the broad outlines of the story are kind of similar. I mean, to be fair, like, Upson Pratt in the Creepshow segment was way more of a dick than Justice was. But, I mean, not to diminish Justin's shitheadery at all, because he did suck. But, you know, it's all kind of on a spectrum. So yeah, I mean, I actually like this segment a lot. I especially enjoyed the character of Elizabeth because she kind of came across as like kind of a pitiful, pathetic kind of person at first, because she was like kept bothering this dude that like they'd gone on like 3 dates or something, and she was just kind of like, love me, you know what I mean? So it was that kind of thing. But she became like a lot more relatable and like a lot more likable, like as she started like turning the tables on him. So I liked that a lot about it. So this was another one of the kind of barely there joke segments. It was called Junior. And this one has Wally Cox in it, and he plays this dad, and he gets woke up in the middle of the night by his quote-unquote child calling to him for a drink of water. Now, his wife, who's in bed next to him, is like, you deal with it, it's your kid. And then we find out that the child in question is actually Frankenstein's monster, like lying on a crib in a nursery, just because, for reasons. And then the monster, for some reason, like pours the water on his face instead of drinking it, which kind of obliged me to make that whole drinking problem joke from Airplane. Then I was like, the end. So the next segment is called Marmalade Wine. And I have to admit, I'm not really sure if I got this segment. This is weird as all get out. It kind of seemed like it was deliberately set up to look like a stage play, but that really confused me because that factor didn't really play into the story. So it made me wonder whether the set just looked cheap by accident instead of on purpose or not. I wasn't really sure what was going on with it. Incidentally, this was actually based on a story by the very famous like supernatural and children's fiction author Joan Aiken. So Robert Morris is in this. He was also in The Loved One, among many other things. He plays a guy named Roger Blacker. And he's a guy who's wandering through a very fake-looking landscape of spindly trees during a very fake-looking thunderstorm. So he's wearing a camera around his neck and kind of stumbling around like a drunk, which I thought, again, was going to have something to do with the plot, but no, not really. I mean, I guess he's lost, but luckily for him, a man seems to magically appear like up in the rafters. This is very much like a stage play. And so this guy's like, he says that he'll help. So Mysterious Rafter Man then seems like he teleports like down next to Roger and then leads the dude to his remote house, which is actually just a bit of white decking like in front of a completely black backdrop. Like it doesn't really look like a house is what I'm saying. So this guy introduces himself as Dr. Deaking, and it's established that he used to be quite a well-known surgeon for Hollywood starlets back in the day, but he's now retired. So he actually gives Roger like a bunch of this marmalade wine that is in the title. And Roger seemingly gets drunker and drunker, but he was acting kind of drunk before, like I said, so it's difficult to tell how much of that is just like effect of the wine and how much of that was just what he's actually like. So they have this discussion in which it becomes obvious that Roger is not really a photographer, even though he brags to Dr. Deaking that his pictures have appeared in like all the major magazines. I didn't really get why Roger had been walking around with a camera that he obviously had no clue how to use. That was like one of the confusing things about this segment. Like, what was Roger doing before he ended up at this dude's house? And like, why did he lie about being a photographer specifically? Like, why is he walking around with a camera? Did he just think he was going to come across somebody that he would have to lie to? That he was a photographer for some reason? Like, I didn't get it. I didn't get what the reason was behind that. So anyway, so the drunker Roger gets, the more, like, brags he makes. At one point, he even tells Deaking that he can see the future. So Deaking is actually really interested in this, and he asks Roger to predict the results of an upcoming horse race and also, like, an election that's going to be the next day or something. So Roger's obviously getting very, very drunk, but even in this whole boozy haze that he's in, he seems to remember that he had heard Dr. Deaking's name before, but he can't, like, remember the context, like what he heard about him exactly. And it's kind of really starting to get to him. But not too long after this, he passes out. Now, when he wakes up, he's in a bed, like in another very Spartan room. There's no furniture in it or anything like that. And the excited doctor is telling him that both of his predictions came true about who was going to win the horse race and who was going to win the election. And the doctor ended up winning a bunch of money. Now, at this point, Roger actually confesses that he was bullshitting. He said, I can't really see the future at all. I just picked a horse and a candidate at random, and I just happened to get it right. The doctor is not having it, though, and starts very happily asking Roger to, like, predict some more shit. You know what I mean? Roger says, nope, can't do that. Gotta scoot. Got stuff to do. But then, right around this time, he also remembers the fact about Dr. Deaking that he couldn't recall before, because it turned out that there was like some scandal years ago, and the doctor had had his license revoked. And then, almost immediately after this, Deaking tells Roger, very cheerfully, that it's like, oh, by the way, you won't be leaving this place ever, because I've cut off your feet. So, like, I have so many questions. Well, okay, one, why did the sets look stylized, like a stage play, when that really didn't seem germane to the story? Like, this didn't have to be like a stage play type story. It didn't like play into that, into the narrative. Like, who was Roger exactly? Why was he wandering around out here near the doctor's house in the first place? Like, where was he going? What was his goal? Why did he make up these random lies about himself? Like, what was the purpose of that? And what about... And Dr. Deaking, like, did he deliberately target Roger because he knew something about him? Or was he just, like, some psycho who kidnapped everybody that walked by his place, or what? Like, did he know that Roger was going to falsely claim to be a psychic? And, like, if so, how did he know that? Like, was Roger really psychic after all, and that was the reason that the doctor wanted to keep him around? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it just didn't make any sense. So, yeah, I will say that, like, even though I have no idea what was going on in this story, it was still, like, a pretty enjoyable segment. It was just, like, really, really baffling, and, like, the whole time I was just like, this is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. Like, it doesn't make any sense at all. So the next story is called The Academy, and this one was, again, written by Rod Serling, based on a story by David Eli, and was directed by Jeff Corey. This one was a little bit dull, a little bit anticlimactic. All the acting was good, but it was just kind of meh all around. So Pat Boone is in this. Yes, that Pat Boone. And he's kind of this important muckety-muck dude named Mr. Holston. And his wife has died. And he has a teenage son who you actually never see, who's kind of like a bit of a tearaway, as they would say in the UK. So Pat shows up at this real strict, like, military boarding school type place with a view to seeing if his son will be accepted as a cadet there because, you know, the boy needs some discipline and all that kind of stuff. So pretty much the entirety of the segment is Mr. Holston being given like a tour of the place, complete with cadets being yelled at by drill instructors and then like marching around in formation and blah blah blah. So Mr. Holston notices, like as he's kind of going around the grounds and talking to some of the cadets, that there's like a really strangely wide range of ages like among the students. Like some of the cadets are very clearly like in their 30s, 40s, 50s. You know what I mean? So some of them, they're not kids, in other words. So it turns out that the big quote unquote secret of the academy is that nobody ever leaves there. Like there's one old cadet who's working the entrance gate, and he very proudly tells Mr. Holston, I arrived at the academy when I was 15, and that was 40 years ago. You know what I mean? So, I mean, honestly, I thought that there was going to be something more sinister going on at this place than, drop your teenage boy off and they live here forever. But no, that's it. I mean, that's it. I mean, the students don't look like they're being tortured or really mistreated in any way other than, their lives being really regimented as they would in any military or anything like that. They just can't leave. And really, none of them even seem to want to. So I don't really know why that's supposed to be like all that sinister. So at the end of the story, like the director of the place like tells Mr. Holston, yeah, we'd be happy to accept your son. And Mr. Holston says, yeah, I'll drop the kid off tomorrow, thus ridding himself of his troublesome son for the foreseeable future, which is nice. I mean, like I said, it doesn't really seem like that terrifying of an outcome, really. I mean, I guess it sucks that the son didn't get any say in the matter, but like I said, it could have been a lot worse. So, yeah, this one was fine, but it just went on a bit too long, and it wasn't as scary as it seemed like it was trying to be. You know what I mean? Like the big revelation of, yeah, I'll bring my kid here tomorrow, like after he saw what was going on. I'm just like, oh, all right. You know what I mean? I think, it would have been a lot cooler if Holston had found out that, that the directors of the academy were like, I don't know, like turning the cadets into like dog chow or sacrificing them to demons or something like that. Like, I thought it was going to be like, oh, holy shit, you know what I mean? They're turning them into fertilizer, you know what I mean? But like nothing. It's like, oh, well, they just can't leave. And I'm just like, whoop-de-doo. Like, and like I said, they didn't really seem to want to, so it wasn't like anything bad was necessarily happening, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, I mean, like the whole thing just felt a little underbaked, I guess. So episode 5, this episode finally, and thankfully, thank fuck, got rid of the whole shorter jokey segments and just focused on 2 longer ones. I mean, so, I appreciated that a lot. Even though both the installments in this one were kind of peculiar, like even by the very peculiar standards of the show. So this one's called The Phantom Farmhouse, and this was based on kind of a classic 1923 story by Seabury Quinn and directed by Gino Swark again. This actually reminded me, both visually and tonally, of the kind of underrated and sort of dreamlike vampire movie called Let's Scare Jessica to Death. That actually came out the same year as this. It came out in 1971, and I think this episode came out in 1971 too. But it gave me that same kind of vibe, you know what I mean? So David McCallum is in this, and he plays a dude named Dr. Joel Winter, who works at this kind of remote sanitarium out in the countryside. Like, I guess it's California. So the beginning of the story, we seem to be in the middle of like a group therapy session type thing. There's kind of several patients sitting around on these weird primary colored platforms that are like round. It's so 70s. And they're just kind of like situated in this tree. Like, it's kind of like a tree house, but not quite. One of the patients is named Gideon, and he's played by David Carradine, and he's like super beardy in this. Like, he looks like a lost member of the Bee Gees, like for real. So he's like constantly playing his guitar, and he seems like a little bit hostile, and some of the other like patients don't seem to like him very much. So through all of this kind of baffling 1970s slang that they say, we slowly find out that Gideon apparently has some apparent delusion about this cottage out in the woods where a family who are called the Squires live. One family member in particular, who's this beautiful young woman named Mildred, is evidently kind of like an object of adoration for everybody that sees her. But the doctor tells Gideon that Mildred isn't real and is just like a manifestation of his like drug-fueled madness or something like that. So it turns out that another patient named May turned up dead like sometime shortly before. He was like completely torn to pieces, like in a field nearby. So the doctor actually shows Gideon a note that was found on the grounds, which Gideon apparently wrote earlier and gave to May, and it was like encouraging him to go and find this mysterious cottage in the woods. And then like after that happened, like then the dude turned up dead. So they think that's a little bit suspicious, right? So Dr. Winter is kind of like curious about this whole situation, and it's, I don't know, it might be implied that he's might be supernaturally compelled a little bit, like to a small degree. Maybe I'm just like reading that into it, but maybe not. So he heads out into the woods himself. And to his surprise, he actually ends up finding the cottage after all. And sure enough, this gorgeous blonde in like old-fashioned clothing comes out of the house and gives Doc like a drink out of the well. Like the well water, they don't really go a lot into this, but like the well water is like super, super clear and super delicious and all this other kind of stuff. So Dr. Winter is just immediately smitten with Mildred, because that's who this is. And she seems to like him right back. Now, there are also two other people in the house. These are presumably Mildred's mom and dad. And they also seem like really friendly and very welcoming. And they were trying to like coax Dr. Winter up onto the porch to kind of hang out with them. But then it'd be probably better if you came back after dark when we'll have more time for company. Because we're very busy right now. You know what I mean? And you're like, So Dr. Winter's like, nah, I got to get back to the shit. But he says he's going to come back soon, though, because he wants to see Mildred again. Several things are creepy about this situation. Mildred, for one, has like super red fingernails, which isn't that weird because, you know, obviously you can get red fingernail polish. But her index finger is like way longer than normal, which is a little bit weird. Also, when Mildred is inside with her parents, Dr. Winter like overhears her saying something along the lines of, "This one's mine, do your own hunting." Which, you know, anyone getting the idea that Dr. Winter might be in a little bit of danger here? Perhaps. So he goes back to the sanitarium and asks a couple shepherds, groundskeepers, I'm not sure who these dudes are, like, what's the deal with the cottage in the woods? But, like, they look at him like he has three heads. They're like, look, there hasn't been a house there in, like, years and years because the whole shebang, like, burned down, like, way back in the day. All that's there now is, like, a chimney, like a kind of burned chimney, and 3 graves. That's all that's left. There's no house there. So not too long after this, another one of the patients, whose name is Betty, basically tells Dr. Winter that the Squires are werewolves, okay? Now, of course, he doesn't believe that, you know, and not only because he's a man of science, damn it, but also because he started to fall for Mildred, just like everybody else who meets her does. Betty also tells him that Gideon has pentagrams on the palms of his hands. So after that, like, a couple of sheep are found torn apart, and the shepherds are, like, freaking out. Like, they're trying to give Dr. Winter, like, a crucifix to protect him before he goes into the woods and blah, blah, blah. But he's not down with all of this supernatural hogwash, and he's going to go out there and see her anyway. But when he gets to the cottage, Mildred tells him that because she loves him, she can't see him anymore. Like, but she won't tell him why. So he's really distraught by this, but finally leaves. Now, unfortunately, when he gets back to the sanitarium, he discovers that Betty, the other patient, has also been found mangled and dead, like out in the field. So Gideon finally shows the doctor these pentagrams that he has in his hands, which aren't actually really pentagrams. They're just like kind of circles with big stars. They're not even like crisscrossy stars. They're just like, they kind of look like cookie cutter stars, I thought. But yeah, so it's kind of like that. So yeah, so he's like, yeah, I got these. And basically Gideon implies that he made a deal with the Squires to like send victims out their way. So anybody that sees the cottage, which like I said isn't really there, like has basically been marked for death. Like they're going to be the next one to go. So the doctor is finally starting to believe that, ooh, maybe something supernatural is going on. You know, so he heads back out to the cottage to ask Mildred, like, what's up with all this bullshit. Now, she seems to kind of confirm this whole werewolf thing. Like, her eyes go all black and red. And then she says, you need to get the hell out of here and, like, forget about me. And then she finally tells him, you know, very sadly, he's like, you know what you should do is you come back to the cottage before dawn, like the next day, and read the prayer for the dead, like out of a prayer book or whatever. You know, just go to the 3 graves on the property and read it. And the doc is all like, what? Why do you want me to do that? But, like, she just tells him, you have to do it, you have to do it. So he's finally, like, he's all crying and shit. And he's just like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So on his way back to the sanitarium, like, through the dark woods, because it started to get kind of nighttime, he gets set upon by 2 wolves who, like, try to eat him, right? But then he is seemingly rescued by a 3rd blonde wolf, which actually kind of looks more like a golden retriever, not gonna lie. So he's okay. And he gets back to the place, and then the next morning he comes back and, like, reads the prayer at the graves, like he said he would. So there's all kind of like howling and growling and supernatural wind and all kind of stuff going on, like while he's reading it. And then like he passes out. And then when he comes to, the cottage is gone. Now it's just like a burned ruin, like everybody else said it was. And he's just kind of left to confusedly wander around the site, like calling for Mildred, and that's like the end. So I guess you're kind of led to believe that Mildred did actually fall in love with Dr. Winter and had him send her family's souls to hell, I guess, like to prevent them from killing him. So I guess they were kind of ghosts, like as well as werewolves. I mean, they were werewolves, and it's like, but I don't know. So that was kind of like a whole situation. So yeah, this was kind of an okay story too. It's kind of slowly paced and kind of bizarre, like what with all the '70s stuff like intermingled with the sort of gothic trappings of the original story, which actually this adaptation does follow pretty closely because I did read the original story. But but like I said, it kind of works like in a weird way. But this was kind of like an odd segment. Now this second segment, which is called Silent Snow, Secret Snow, this was also pretty weird, mainly because it's based on a short story that really isn't conducive to a filmed adaptation, because most of it is like a person's inner thoughts, which is always like really hard to, translate to a visual medium. So this is actually based on Conrad Aiken's, probably his most famous story, which was initially published in 1932 and has turned up in just a ton of American fiction anthologies, like in the years since then. So the story doesn't really have a plot, like in the classic sense. And in order to, I guess, capture the feel of the source story, what they did was they just had Orson Welles do like a voiceover. Like he's basically like reading parts of the story like while the events are unfolding on the screen or whatever. So the story is about a boy named Paul who just starts to become more and more fascinated with snow, which leads to him becoming kind of increasingly withdrawn from his friends and family. And I mean, that's pretty much it. Orson Welles tells us that Paul's obsession seemed to start with like the approaching footsteps of the postman, which were more muffled than usual one day, leading Paul to assume that it had snowed in the night. And then he looks out the window, but there isn't any snow. But this doesn't like seem to faze him. Like he keeps imagining beautiful snowy landscapes like wherever he goes. So his teachers and his parents, who are kind of clueless, they really have no idea like why Paul seems to have suddenly retreated into his own world, I guess. He won't really tell them anything about his inner thoughts, what's going on with him. So his parents eventually call a doctor, and after the parents and the doctor kind of essentially just like harangue this kid long enough, he finally just tells them, look, I just like thinking about snow. And like he just kind of breaks away and runs for his room, and then when he goes in his room, it's just full of all this swirling snow, and he just like spins around in it like all rapturous and everything like that. And then eventually, according to the voiceover, the snow kind of whispers things to him and then seems to like overtake him, and then the screen goes black. So the short story that this was based on, which like I said, this does follow pretty closely, it's essentially like an extended metaphor, although its specific meaning is kind of open for interpretation. There have been a couple different ideas about it. Like some people have seen it as like a retreat from reality into fantasy, or a representation of a particular kind of mental illness. I actually interpreted it as maybe like the kid's morbid fascination with and eventual acceptance of his own death. I thought that's what it was, but I could be totally pulling that out of my ass. I'm not really sure. That was just the impression that I got. And I would be interested to hear other people's opinions about it, though, because like I said, it is very open to interpretation. So as I mentioned, this installment was very strange and quite unlike anything that had been done on Night Gallery before. I'm not really sure that if this particular story was the best choice for an adaptation, since all of it takes place like inside a boy's head, I mean, pretty much. But I do have to admit that there was something kind of eerie about it. And I mean, it's always very pleasant to listen to Orson Welles' very distinctive voice, which I think kind of lent the whole thing, like, again, like more of that eeriness. I do have a feeling that probably most audiences would have just thought it was kind of boring or pointless, though, because like I said, it's not like a classic horror story like a lot of the other ones on here, where it was just kind of like, I don't even know if I'd call it a vignette, but it is just very much like an extended metaphor, pretty much. So, episode 6. This first segment, A Question of Fear, easily one of the best and creepiest segments of the series, even if it's also probably one of the simplest. It's not like a super original story, it's been done tons of times before, but it was just like the execution was really good. So, this actually has a very impressive performance by Leslie Nielsen, who actually, like, during the whole middle portion of the story, like, has almost no dialogue, but he's actually able to really, like, convey, like, the ordeal that he's going through. So this was directed by Jack Laird, based on a story by Brian Lewis. So the story starts at a gentleman's club, and there's a man there with completely white hair named Dr. Matzi, who's played by Fritz Weaver. And he's telling a group of 3 other men about this horrifying night that he spent in a haunted house, which not only turned his hair white overnight, but also made him have a nervous breakdown, and he ended up having to spend 3 years, like, in a sanitarium. So another one of the guys that's there, who's named Colonel Denny Malloy, he's played by Leslie Nielsen, he's got an eye patch and everything. He's absolutely not shy about just blowing his own horn, and, you know, just regaling, like, the other men with his own feats of badassery, you know what I mean? He's very much that kind of dude. And he basically calls Matzi a pussy for, like, freaking out in a so-called. He doesn't use that word, but almost. For just, like, freaking out at a haunted house, which isn't even real, bro. You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing. So Matzi basically tells Malloy, well, why don't you just put your money where your mouth is? I will give you 10 large if you will stay overnight in the same house without dropping dead from fright. So Malloy, of course, who is just this arrogant douche, he's like, yeah, I'll fucking do that. I'll take your money. So then, like, not long after that, he shows up at the, you know, fateful mansion, and scary shit begins to happen, like, pretty much immediately. Like, the front door slams by itself, there's, like, footsteps and moaning, like, kind of echoing through the house, and at one point, like, he even sees this kind of glowing green severed head, like, floating around in the hallway, and he actually, like, shoots at it, but it doesn't do anything. Now, as I mentioned, this very long sequence of Malloy, like, moving through the house and encountering various, like, spooky tableaus, like, is, you know, there's, like, blood dripping from nowhere, you know, there's a dining table covered with rats, you know what I mean, very Miss Havisham kind of situation. There's disembodied laughing, sobbing, all that kind of stuff. This part is almost entirely without dialogue, because Malloy is just kind of trying to maintain his sort of, like, tough guy veneer as he's going through the house, right? Now, he seems to be operating under the assumption that all of this is fake, but we can kind of see the doubt, like, beginning to creep into his expression, like, as all of these paranormal manifestations start, like, ramping up, you know? So finally, he gets down to the basement, where a lot of the moaning and laughing is kind of the loudest, you know what I mean? So he kind of, like, takes a break, you know, has a smoke, has a cup of coffee from his thermos that he brought, and he also starts to hear, like, this discordant piano, like, playing, like, nearby. So he goes into a back room, and he sees this glowing green dude, like, sitting at the piano playing it, and the dude, like, turns around and stretches his hands out toward Malloy, and then the hands, like, catch fire. Like, it's actually, like, kind of cool looking. I mean, the effects are, like, pretty cheesy. It's 1971, but it's still, like, kind of cool looking. So, yeah, I mean, this would seem to be the culmination of all of this ghostly activity that Malloy has been seeing up to this point, because there has been a lot of it. But then he notices a very suspicious black power cord leading to this supposed ghost. So he's like, aha! So he, like, very triumphantly kind of cuts the power cord, and this obviously causes the ghost and his little flaming hands to disappear. So yeah, everything we've seen in the house up to this point has been fake, just like Malloy thought. And, you know, to be honest, it doesn't really come as much of a surprise to you, the viewer, because the paranormal shit in this joint was, like, way too over the top to have not been fake, you know what I mean? Like, the second the dude walks in, he's like, whoa, 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 you know what I mean? It's, like, fucking crazy. So Malloy just, like, very smugly tells Matzi, who he presumes is, like, listening somewhere, oh, you're gonna have to do better than that, like, if you want to scare me. I'm already looking forward to, like, spending that 10 grand that I'm gonna win off you. So Malloy then trucks his little self-satisfied ass up to a bedroom, like, where he's gonna kip out for the night. And he actually finds another power cord, like, under the bed. They don't really say what it's for, but he, like, cuts that too. But if you're paying close attention, you will note that Malloy seems to stumble a bit as he's getting ready to, like, get in the bed, almost as though he's been drugged, perhaps. He kind of shakes it off though, and then like he kind of settles down on top of the covers. But just then, these big like metal restraint bars like pop out the mattress and like go over him like that, and they like hold him in place. And then this big old semicircular blade comes out of the ceiling, like Pit in the Pendulum style, and starts coming swinging down like toward his throat. Right now, it gets like pretty close, and Malloy is maybe starting to think, hey, this shit really isn't funny anymore, you guys. And he's basically like yelling to Motzi, who, like I said, you can't see him, but you assume that he's listening. He's like, haha, joke's over, yeah. You can't really kill me. That would not be cool, and all this other stuff. But then the blade stops, just like an inch or so from like beheading him. And then Malloy seems to sort of like pass out, like fall asleep. I mean, we're led to assume that he's finally succumbing to the drugs that we're pretty sure that he was administered at some unknown time earlier. So when he wakes up the next morning, like the blade and the restraints are completely gone, as if they've never even been there. And Malloy just kind of smiles to himself, hey, it's morning, I won the bet. So he goes downstairs, and weirdly, like, eggs are cooking on the stove, like, there's a hot pot of coffee on the table, like, 2 slices of toast pop out the toaster, even though there's, like, nobody else around. So just then, Malloy notices there's a TV, like, mounted on the wall, and then there's a video camera, like, kind of mounted on top of that. So the TV comes on, and there's Motzi, and he has regular brownish hair instead of the white hair, you know what I mean? So that was all a ruse. Motzi says that he can also see and hear Malloy because of the video camera, so they can see each other and they can talk to each other, so it's like Zoom or some shit, like in 1971. So basically, Motzi tells Malloy that he'd been looking for him for a long time, because back during the war, Malloy captured Motzi's father, who was a concert pianist, and he actually burned his hands to like down to useless stumps, right, when the dude wouldn't give him the information that he asked for. And you're led to assume that the father, like Motzi's father, didn't even have this information, so he just like burned him up for nothing. So what Motzi did was he just kind of slowly ingratiated himself into Malloy's like circle of friends and engineered this whole haunted house situation basically in order to take revenge on him. So he hears this whole story, but Malloy is still like smug as fuck, right? Because he reminds Motzi, he's like, well, your scheme didn't work. Like, I uncovered your fakery in the house, like I figured out it was fake, and I lived through the night, so I still won the bet. And then Motzi's like, not so fast. And then he tells Malloy, he's like, I did actually drug your coffee last night. Like, I was in the house last night, and like when you turned your back on your thermos, like I put this drug in it that would knock you out. And while Malloy was out, Motzi injected him with this serum that he invented, which will essentially like dissolve all of Malloy's bones very slowly and turn him into an earthworm. Like, even though all of his mental faculties and stuff like that will remain intact, so he'll be able to like realize what's happening to him. So Malloy is like not buying this shit for a second, thinking this is like one last mind fuck, right? He's like, yeah, right, you're gonna turn me into a fucking earthworm, what the fuck ever. But Motzi insists, no, it's true. Malloy, you need to go back down to the cellar, and if you go down there, you will find what remains of my colleague who was also injected with this serum and is now basically like a human slug, right? Now, this ties in really nicely with some weird shit Malloy saw earlier while he was exploring the house. Like, he found what we now recognize as like a wide slime trail, like going across the floor. Though at the time, like neither he nor the audience knew what that was. So I like that they kind of had that little hint of what was to come, like, even though you didn't know what it was. Because I was, like, looking at it going, what the fuck is that? You know what I mean? So Malloy still thinks it's all bullshit, though, but Motzi keeps telling him, no, I'm serious. Like, go down to the cellar and have a look at what your ultimate fate is going to be, right? And Malloy does go part of the way down there and then catches sight of, like, part of the slime trail that looks like it's going back into this room that he didn't go into. And then he, like, flips out and he, like, goes, just hightails it back up to the kitchen. And then he screams at Motzi, it's like, well, you still lost the bet. And then he picks up his pistol and just, like, shoots himself in the head, right? Which seems a little counterproductive, but okay. He just didn't want to give Motzi the satisfaction of, like, seeing him turn into a slug, right? But Motzi then, like, leans back on the TV and smiles. And he says to Malloy's dead body, no, you lose. There is nothing in the cellar. And I was like, fuck, gotcha, bitch. Even though I was pretty sure. I'm like, there's nothing in the cellar. He's just fucking with him. And he was. But he got him to kill himself, so win. Yeah, this was a great episode. It's very creepy, very fun, very well acted. A couple good twists and turns. Like I said, you can see them coming, but it's not that big of a deal. I mean, yeah, particularly by today's standards, like it's pretty predictable, and I think most people would see where it was going. But I still, that didn't diminish my enjoyment of it. I still had a ball with it, and honestly, I wouldn't hesitate to call it one of the best segments of the entire series. Like it's really, really good. So the next one is called "The Devil Is Not Mocked." This one is much shorter and, frankly, like even more predictable. Honestly, kind of cheesy, gonna say. So I didn't really enjoy it nearly as much as the first one. This was directed by Gene R. Kearney, and it was based on a short story by Manly Wade Wellman, who's a very, very famous horror author. So at the beginning, there's an old dude, and he's telling his grandson what he did in World War II. And then we kind of like jump back in time for like a flashback. So the Nazis are, being their horrible Nazi selves in this area of the Balkans that they've taken over. So they're now like camped out in front of this kind of crumbling old castle, just, shooting at people and like mocking the stupid peasants in the region and all of that. So the head guy of this contingent of assholes is General von Grun. And he believes that this castle that they're in front of is the secret base of the resistance, or a secret base of the resistance. So imagine his surprise then when the master of the castle, who's like the old guy from the beginning, he answers the door like in all his fucking formal wear splendor, like opera cape and the whole fucking deal. I'm like, woo, where's this guy going? He's going out for a fun night out. But yeah, so he opens the door and he just like welcomes the Nazis into the house like with open arms, right? Which is a little strange. So the Nazis, apparently as idiotic as they are evil, go inside the castle and start kind of rooting around, like looking for resistance members and stuff like that. And then the whole time, like the master of the castle, which I don't even think they give him a name until later, like the punchline, but they just call him like the master up till now. So he's very calmly like encouraging them to eat dinner. He's laid out this big feast for them. He's like, oh, sit down and have something. And it's like, none of it's poisoned, I swear. And like he has like some of the servants eat it so they can show it's not poisoned and blah, blah, blah. It's like, hey, maybe even avail yourselves of one of the servant girls. It's fine. Like everything is here for you, blah, blah, blah. So the entire time, like, wolves are howling very obtrusively outside, so you can probably guess, like, in what direction all of this is going, right? So the general kind of reluctantly, like, sits down to eat dinner with the master, and the master the whole time is being like, oh, there's no resistance going on. In here, it's totally fine. So the more the master denies it, like, the general just gets crankier and crankier, and he's, like, threatening to put the master up against the wall and shoot him and all this other kind of stuff. But the master just, like, totally keeps his cool, right? So the general says to the masters, like, look, I have 100 men outside, and you better act right, or you and all of your little resistance peeps are gonna fucking get it, right? But then the general starts hearing screaming from outside and looks out to see his men being attacked by all of the kind of servants and resistance members from earlier. So yeah, the upshot of it is that the master is Count Dracula. That's who that is. And the like resistance fighter servant people are all vampires, obviously. So then they proceed to eat the Nazis, and then we return to the present day master, like where he's showing his grandson the medal that he won in the war, like for his heroic deeds in service of his country, and blah blah blah. The end. You know what I mean? So yeah, like I said, this one's kind of silly, and you could pretty much see where it was going from like a mile away. But it's always nice to see Nazis get fucked up, so I'll allow it, even though it was, like I said, not really that great a story. But I mean, the first segment was miles better, but this one's okay too. But it's just, like I said, just super predictable. So that's going to do it for the first 6 episodes of season 2. Be sure to keep watching this space for whenever I get around to doing the next half dozen, because I'm still working on Thriller as well. So until then, just keep on trucking. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and all of that business. And I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.